For over 100 years, the story of Grigori Rasputin's death has been told the same way. Poisoned with enough cyanide to kill 5 grown men, shot in the chest at close range, beaten with a rubber dumbbell, and still alive, still fighting, when his killers finally bound him and threw him into the freezing Neva River, where he supposedly drowned, still trying to break free. It's one of the most famous death scenes in modern history. Forensic historians who have actually gone back to the original 1916 autopsy report now believe almost none of it happened that way. Grigori Rasputin was a Siberian peasant and self-proclaimed holy man who by the winter of 1916 had become one of the most powerful unelected men in the Russian Empire. Trusted by Tsarina Alexandra herself, because he seemed to be the only person alive who could calm the bleeding of her hemophiliac son, heir to the Russian throne. To the aristocrats watching their empire crumble under a catastrophic war, Rasputin wasn't a healer. He was a dangerous outsider secretly steering the government from behind a bedroom door, and they wanted him dead. On the night of December 29, 1916, a small circle of Russian nobles invited him to a private dinner in a St. Petersburg palace. By morning, he was dead. But the version of that night that became legend, the one still repeated as fact more than 100 years later, came almost entirely from one source, a killer who spent the rest of his life selling the story. Grigori Rasputin was born a peasant in Siberia around 1869 and arrived in St. Petersburg in his 30s with no formal education, no title, and a reputation as a wandering mystic with an intense, unsettling gaze. What he had instead was a genuine, unexplainable ability to calm the hemophilia symptoms of Tsarevich Alexei, the sickly heir to the Romanov throne. A skill that made him indispensable to Empress Alexandra, who came to believe Rasputin had been sent by God to save her son's life. By 1916, Russia was 2 years into the First World War, and the empire was falling apart. Tsar Nicholas II had left the capital to personally command the army, leaving Alexandra effectively in charge of the government. And Alexandra, in turn, leaned heavily on Rasputin's advice, even on political and military appointments. Rumors spread, wildly exaggerated but politically devastating, that a debauched peasant mystic was secretly running the Russian Empire from inside the palace. Among the nobles horrified by this was Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the wealthiest men in Russia, married into the royal family itself. Yusupov became convinced that removing Rasputin was the only way to save the monarchy from itself. He began planning a murder, recruiting Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, the Tsar's own cousin, and a fiercely monarchist politician named Vladimir Purishkevich. They picked a night. They picked a poison. What none of them could have predicted was how the story of what happened next would eventually outgrow the truth. On the night of December 29, 1916, Yusupov invited Rasputin to his family's Moika Palace in St. Petersburg, using his young wife as bait, telling Rasputin she wanted to meet him privately. Yusupov led him down to a basement room set with tea cakes and Madeira wine, both laced, according to Yusupov's own later account, with enough potassium cyanide to kill several men within minutes. Rasputin ate the cakes. He drank the wine. By Yusupov's telling, nothing happened at all. Rasputin sat calmly, chatting for hours, seemingly immune. Panicked, Yusupov went upstairs, retrieved a revolver, came back down, and shot Rasputin once in the chest. Rasputin collapsed. The conspirators believed him dead and went to dispose of the body. Only in Yusupov's account for Rasputin to suddenly spring back to his feet, lunge at Yusupov's throat, and stagger out into the palace courtyard on his hands and knees, trying to escape over a fence. Purishkevich chased him into the snow and fired twice more, missing both times, before a final shot struck Rasputin in the back and dropped him. The men beat the body, wrapped it, and drove it to the Petrovsky Bridge, where they broke a hole in the ice and threw him into the Neva River below. That is the story Felix Yusupov told and kept telling for the rest of his life. When forensic investigators and historians finally went back to the original 1916 autopsy report decades later, almost none of it held up. The original autopsy, conducted within days of the body's recovery and rediscovered by later historians, tells a very different story. Rasputin's stomach and organs were tested for poison. None was found. No trace of cyanide anywhere in his system, despite Yusupov's claim that he had eaten and drunk enough to kill 5 men. Rasputin had been shot 3 times, not once, including a final close-range contact wound directly to the center of his forehead, the kind of shot that kills almost instantly and is consistent with a deliberate execution, not a desperate struggle in the dark. And critically, the autopsy found no water in his lungs. A living person thrown into a freezing river will instinctively gasp and inhale water while drowning. Rasputin's lungs were dry. He was already dead before his body ever touched the Neva. There had been no miraculous survival of cyanide, no struggle back to life after a fatal gunshot, no desperate final swim in icy water. The single, undeniable detail investigators kept returning to was the forehead wound. A controlled, close-range execution shot almost certainly fired last, once the other men were certain he could not get up again. The myth of the unkillable mad monk, the story that had circulated in newspapers and later films for generations, had a much simpler, far less supernatural explanation sitting in a police file the entire time. He was killed the way most people are killed, with a gun at close range by men who made sure of it. Word of Rasputin's death spread through St. Petersburg within a day, and much of the public and the nobility celebrated openly, but it changed nothing about the empire's collapse. Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate barely 2 months later, in March 1917. By July 1918, he, Empress Alexandra, and all 5 of their children, including the hemophiliac Alexei that Rasputin had spent years trying to save, were executed by Bolshevik revolutionaries in a basement in Yekaterinburg. Felix Yusupov, the man who orchestrated the murder, was merely exiled to one of his family's estates, a punishment so light it scandalized other nobles. He eventually fled Russia entirely after the revolution, settling in Paris, where he spent much of the rest of his life broke, selling off family jewels and repeatedly retelling and embellishing the story of Rasputin's death. First in a 1927 memoir, then again in a more dramatic 1953 version, each retelling adding new flourishes about superhuman resistance to poison and bullets. Historians now widely believe Yusupov exaggerated or fabricated much of the account for the same reason he kept selling it for nearly 40 years. It was the single most valuable story he had left. A monk who couldn't be killed made for a far better legend and a far more impressive murderer than an unarmed man shot 3 times by 4 people who outnumbered him. Felix Yusupov successfully sued MGM in 1934 over a film depicting the murder and lived off the settlement money for years. Proof that even decades later, his version of Rasputin's death was still generating value for the man who told it. He died in Paris in 1967, having outlived almost everyone else in the story, still insisting his account was the truth. Grigori Rasputin's real death was almost certainly far less cinematic than legend remembers it. A planned execution, 3 gunshots, no miracle, no river-drowning struggle. But the myth endures because it's a better story. A peasant mystic so supernaturally resistant to death that his killers needed poison, bullets, and a river to finally be sure. It transformed a political assassination into a ghost story and turned the men who committed it into the heroes of their own legend for the rest of their lives. We've been wrong about Rasputin's death for over 100 years, mostly because we were only ever told one side of it by the one man who benefited most from making it sound impossible. Subscribe if you want more. See you in the next one.